Welcome back to In Session. I'm Danny Savalas. The defense says John Goodman had a few drinks the night of the crash, but was not drunk. Police tested the defendant's blood alcohol levels about 3 hours after the crash and found they were more than 2 times the legal limit in Florida. Here to talk about blood alcohol testing is DUI attorney, the great George Stein. Welcome, George.
Thank you, Danny.
You know, George, in the era of CSI, I think a lot of people see blood alcohol tests. They see 0.17 and they conclude, well, that must be right. It's science. It's got to be accurate. And every day, thousands of people are convicted by these machines. So if people are losing their liberty over it, it's got to be a perfect science, as pure as the law of gravity, as pure as the speed of light. What do you say to an assertion like that?
Well, you know, there's a lot of science out there that I consider to be junk science that gets people convicted every day. And so the science isn't so great. I mean, gas chromatography, blood testing is probably, better than breath testing. But, it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination.
But what happens with, what a lot of people don't know is that what happens with any test that is taken a certain period of time, whether it's an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, how much does that actually tell us, a blood alcohol reading at 2 or 3 hours after a crash, about what a person's blood alcohol content was at the time of operation? Because that really is the prosecution's burden, isn't it?
It is, but it's many times a guess. Now, there's some formulas that they use that extrapolate backwards. There's something called Widmark's formula.
Right.
The average human being takes approximately, adult male takes about 90 minutes to get to their highest BAC. Probably a female a little bit lower, maybe 75 minutes. And so when they're doing this, they're relying on a certain baseline from a machine, and then they're trying to go backwards in time. But the problem is, if that baseline is not accurate, then their estimation is not accurate either.
Well, again, people, as we always say, people should not drink and drive. But in this case, one of the defenses I see possibly at the outset is going to be, and the defense seems to be setting up, that John Goodman, if he drank 5, 6, 7, 10 drinks right before he leaves and gets in his car, if either of us did that, stepped into our car, for the next at least 10 to 15 minutes, as well before we get it absorbed, we're not actually intoxicated. Is that true?
That's true. That's the mistake people make, Danny. It's not so much what you drank, it's what's in your belly and what's going to happen over time. If you drink quite a few shots over 15 or 20 minutes, quite often you're pretty good. But as you reach that past 1 hour mark and go towards that 90-minute mark while you're driving, that's usually when the police stop you, by the way. But that's when you start running into trouble. That's when you're driving on your way home and you say, something's wrong. I'm starting to feel this.
Right, exactly. So when it comes to breath and blood testing, the reality is more often we see breath testing than blood testing, right?
It's quick and easy, but it's not very accurate.
Well, that doesn't hurt the prosecution. It usually inures to their benefit, right?
Well, they try to pump up the machine and make it sound like it's a great machine and that they tested and they do a diagnostic on it. And they do, normally in most jurisdictions, 2 samples, and they throw out the high one and give you the lower one. But once again, there's an extrapolation that machine is making. It's doing a mathematical formula based on what they call a partition ratio. The average male is 2,100 to 1. I don't want to get too
Slow
technical.
down, George. I barely got out of high school chemistry, okay. So you're going to have to go very easy on me.
So basically speaking, breath testing technology is not very accurate. There's a margin of error. There's problems when females blow into the machine versus males because the partition ratio has a one-size-fits-all sort of software in it. It assumes certain things that aren't true for different human beings. And that's the problem. Certain jurors say, hey, the machine says so, so therefore you must be guilty. And then there's other more fair-minded, probably a little bit more educated jurors who say, you know what, I'm not going to have blind faith in a machine. I remember walking into this courthouse and through a metal detector that's set to pick up on guns and weapons, and it went off, and I didn't have a gun. Yeah. So I don't buy into it.
Well, the thing is, of course, it's not advocating for drinking and driving, because no one should ever really drink and drive, again, even though it's legal. But if the prosecution has to meet its burden, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, every day this science is being used, and I think at minimum we should ask that it be reliable. If people are going to go to jail, I think we should ask that it at least be a reliable science. And I think the DUI bar would say that so far they haven't quite gotten the science right.
That's correct. It's got to be what I call and I use it in every trial, quality evidence. You know, there's just plain old evidence, and then there's quality evidence. And it takes quality evidence to get past that threshold that the state has to, guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And just, you know, plain old evidence doesn't do it.
Now, we don't have to be scientists to sort of understand that John Goodman's BAC, if it was 0.17 4 hours after the crash, will the prosecution run into any problems with, first, introducing that evidence, but secondly, credibility with the jury? Is that going to be solid evidence in this trial if it was 4 hours later? How accurate is that? And what is the prosecution going to be worried about that?
Well, once again, they're going to try to extrapolate backwards and try to estimate what it was at a prior time that evening. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. What the defense is going to do is going to say, well, wait a minute, that's wrong. He drank in between there. You know, he drank after the accident. He was in severe pain. His wrist was messed up. He was hit in the head. He was disoriented. He wanted to deal with the pain. So you heard Roy Black say he took several swigs of liquor in between there after the accident, and that's the basis of their defense. That's how they're trying to create reasonable doubt with that jury saying that number isn't right.
Now, Roy Black, in his opening, I'm glad you mentioned that. In his opening, he talked about if his blood alcohol was a 0.17, had he not drinking between the accident and the blood test, then that means his blood alcohol content would have been some astronomical number, something that would have put you in a coma.
Exactly.
So that the science actually works against the prosecution. That's Roy Black's position, in that he had to have drinking something in between. Otherwise, he would have been balado. The man would have been blasted out of his mind. How effective is a defense like that when you offer the idea that somebody drank in between?
Well, a lot of jurors become skeptical, Danny, when they come to the idea or when it comes to taking in what the prosecution is saying, that somebody had to have, you know, X amount of drinks to get to where they were. And if that number is just way too fantastically high, they go, how could somebody do that? Look, the bar tab didn't say that. He couldn't have had 20-something drinks to get to where he was, because, you know, the average person would be unconscious.
Yeah.
And if you couple in some other evidence around there, when you look at his picture afterwards at the hospital, when John Goodman is being treated, his eyes are clear. He looks pretty responsive. He looks, you know, he's not droopy. He's not sagging. He looks pretty good.
Yeah. I want to talk quickly, very quickly, about one of the other things that's part of the facts in this trial, and it's that John Goodman was apparently taking opiates or something for a back or some other injury, but they were found to be at therapeutic levels, and he wasn't even charged with that. A lot of people are probably wondering, if I have a prescription for an opiate or something that's for pain, should I be driving? I mean, how much could I be guilty of DUI?
Well, when it comes to pharmacology, there's a concept that saves people from what appears to be dangerous, and that's the concept of once you take a drug for a while, your body adjusts. It's called tolerance. Mm-hmm. And once the body becomes tolerant of a drug like an opiate, it really isn't too profound anymore. It's just sort of the normal, even keel norm that you're looking for to be functional and not be in pain. Now, when you first start taking the drugs, then that's the dangerous time. You know, that first week or two until your body adjusts, that's when it can be dangerous.
And I think the law recognizes that. He was found to have therapeutic levels, was not charged with the additional drugs in this case.
Yes.
George Stein, thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. That's all the time we have for today. Join us tomorrow when we will hear from the last person who saw John Goodman before the crash. This is In Session, your front row seat to justice.